I was in my second year at Brooklyn College, living in a rented apartment near the subway, the kind with walls thin as paper and a neighbor who played an out-of-tune guitar late into the night. I had finals coming up, piles of debt, and no thoughts in my head except survival and exams. One day, my mom called me. Not texted, actually called, which was already unusual, and said a sentence that made my head spin. "Grandma is pregnant." I froze. I thought it was a cruel joke or a glitch in reality. My grandmother was 80. She lived alone in a small house on the outskirts of Queens, grew roses, baked perfect apple charlottes, and yelled at neighbors whose dogs pooped on her lawn. I rushed to her house immediately, heart pounding with fear, confusion, disbelief. I needed to see her eyes, to hear the explanation. Maybe it was a prank or some tragic medical mistake. Grandma greeted me like nothing had happened, with a smile, in a soft blue robe, flipping pancakes that filled the house with their sweet smell. But her eyes were different. Deep, glowing, soft, like those of a girl in love. "Is it true?" I asked, not even sure I wanted the answer. "It's true," she said, gently stroking her belly. "I'm carrying a new life, and it's the most wonderful thing that could have happened to me." I collapsed into a chair, the ground vanishing from under my feet. 80? And pregnant? She pulled out a folder with medical reports and showed me an ultrasound image, a tiny being, clearly formed, a visible heartbeat. I couldn't comprehend it, but doctors confirmed it. A real pregnancy. 18 weeks along, a biological miracle. And the surprises didn't stop there. A few weeks later, I saw a man walk into her house. In his 50s, tanned, lean, with kind eyes and hands marked by years of working the soil. This was Luis, her gardener. He had cared for her yard for 6 years, trimming bushes, replanting roses, digging flower beds. I had seen him before. Quiet, reserved, practically invisible. I never imagined anything personal could exist between them. But Grandma told me she was in love. Deeply. She said he looked at her like no one ever had. That around him she felt young again. Alive. Wanted. But everything fell apart when she told him about the baby. Luis vanished for a week. No calls, no texts. And when he returned, his face was stone cold. He said he couldn't be a father. That it was impossible. That he wasn't ready. She begged him. Held his hand. Cried. Pleaded. But he left. And never came back. After that, something frightening began to happen. She started writing him letters, 2 or 3 a day, long, emotional, desperate. She kept them in a box tied with a pink ribbon. Cried at night. Covered the house in his photos. On the fridge, the walls, the nightstand. She talked to him like he was still there. Set out 2 cups of tea, dinner, even perfumed napkins. My mom and I were stunned. We tried to convince her to see a doctor, but she refused. "I'm not sick," she said. "I'm just in love." The baby developed normally. Doctors shrugged, baffled but amazed, and in early September she gave birth to a healthy baby boy. 3.2 kilograms, dark hair, strong lungs. She named him Luisito. Grandma was radiant, glowing, singing lullabies in Spanish, whispering love into his tiny ears. She said she finally had everything, that he was her last and only purpose. But joy turned to anxiety, then fear, then paranoia. She began locking the doors with 4 bolts, shutting the blinds, whispering that the neighbors wanted to steal her child. One night, she ran into the street in her robe, barefoot, holding the baby, banging on doors and begging people to stop watching her. The neighbors called the police. Child services came. They took the baby. I watched her scream, sob, cling to a blanket, begging them not to take away her last reason to live. I stood against the wall, completely shattered. They placed her in a psychiatric hospital. Diagnosis: paranoid schizophrenia, triggered by severe emotional trauma. She's still there, in a white room, with a photograph of Luis tucked into the pocket of her robe. Mom visits her every week. I go less often. It still hurts. Luisito was adopted by a family upstate. I don't know if he remembers her. Maybe not. Maybe she's just a line in his medical file. Sometimes, I walk past her old house, where roses used to bloom. I stand by the gate, looking at the peeling walls, and I think, sometimes love really can create miracles. But sometimes, it breaks people beyond repair. 4 years passed. I graduated from college and started working at the local library. Not my dream job, but a steady one. Quiet. Peaceful. Among books, I could hide from the world when it got too loud inside. At first, I couldn't visit her. The pain and guilt were too much. Mom never pressured me. She just kept going every Sunday, bringing her favorite cookies and newspaper clippings. One spring day, I finally went. The clinic was bright and clean, with trimmed hedges and long white hallways. Grandma was sitting by a window, sketching with colored pencils. Her hand trembled a little, but her lines were strong and smooth. On the paper, a garden, a house, a baby stroller under a tree. She recognized me instantly, smiled. "Hi, sweetheart," she said. "You've grown up." I sat beside her. We didn't talk much. She showed me her drawings, a whole folder labeled Dreams of Home. There were scenes from her old life. The kitchen, the rose garden, the baby, Luis. "Do you still love him?" I asked. She shook her head gently. "I'm grateful to him," she said, "for giving me a reason to feel alive, even if only for a little while." The doctor said her condition had stabilized. She was taking part in art therapy, helping other patients, even organizing little events at the clinic. The director suggested a partial discharge program. Grandma smiled and said, "I want to live, not just remember, live." And she did. We started fixing up her house. Hired a crew, repainted the walls, brought the garden back to life. Mom replanted the roses. I found Grandma's old recipe notebook and began baking her charlotte on Sundays. One weekend, Mom brought news. Child Services allowed us to write a letter to Luisito's adoptive family. Just a letter, nothing more. We thought long and hard about what to say. In the end, Grandma wrote by hand. "Dear ones, if he ever asks, tell him his grandmother loved him very much, that he was a miracle, that he came into this world not by accident, but because someone out there needed a real miracle. Please let him be happy. Let him live with a light heart. That's all I ask." A reply came in autumn. Brief, but warm. The adoptive parents wrote that Luisito was growing into a bright, curious boy who loved to draw. That his favorite book was The Garden of Wonders, a children's story with illustrations. They even enclosed one of his drawings, a house and a white-haired woman holding a boy in her arms. I cried when I showed it to Grandma. She stared at it for a long time, then pressed it to her chest. "He remembers," she whispered. "So it wasn't for nothing." Now she's 85. She lives with us again, in a house that smells like baked apples, with blooming roses and walls that no longer peel. Every day she draws. Every evening there are still 2 cups of tea on the table. One for her, one for me. No more pain, just memory, and me. I've realized that sometimes a miracle isn't something that changes reality. Sometimes it's what gives people the strength to survive it.